So welcome everyone. Today we have with us Dr. Groves. She is a research fellow and lecturer at Trinity College, Oxford, and her research focuses on Shakespeare, early modern drama, early modern literature, and 16th and 17th century literature. She was awarded the 16th Century Society Literary Prize for her article on Jerusalem in early modern English travel narratives in 2013. And she also runs an amazing Harry Potter vlog and has written an amazing book entitled Literary Allusion in Harry Potter. So, from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in early modern literature and drama, especially the influence of religion in these texts. So, I know a lot of graduate students find it incredibly difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach the process of pinning down what or who resonates with you, and what led you to the early modern period?
Great, yeah. So lots of questions there. I'll start off with why I did my PhD on, so I did my PhD on Shakespeare and religion, and that was to do with just having an idea. So I was watching Henry IV Part One, and I felt there was a very strong sense of the way that Hal was presenting himself in Christic ways. And so that stories about Christ, particularly the harrowing of hell, the idea of Christ as a sort of military redeemer of people, was something that Hal was positioning himself as. I don't think he's a Christ figure, but I think he was someone who's seeing the power of those narratives and positioning himself in that way. So I had a look at whether people had written about religion and Shakespeare that much, and they just hadn't. So this was back in sort of 1999. And so I went and, those days we didn't have online searching. They were the sort of big tomes in the Cambridge UL that I opened and had a look, and there was like nothing under Shakespeare religion since the 40s, really. So I thought, oh, great, there's definitely a topic here. And I went to my supervisor in Cambridge, who was called Eric Griffiths, who was an absolutely inspirational tutor. And I said, I'm sort of thinking of doing Shakespeare as my PhD, and I'm a bit worried because, you know, an article is published on Shakespeare every 7 minutes. How am I ever going to say anything new about him? And he said, more has been written on Shakespeare than on anyone else, and there's more still to write on Shakespeare than on anyone else. And I thought, what a nice way of putting it. And I think when you're choosing a topic, I would definitely, another thing he said to me was this idea of, either have a big idea about a small person or a small idea about a big person. And I think that's quite a good way of doing it. You don't want to do the theory of tragedy in Shakespeare. That's too big for a PhD. But if you could do the theory of tragedy in a much smaller author or a small area of a big author. And I think that that's a good way of thinking about it. So if you like big concepts, then stick with less studied people. If you quite like nitty-gritty, I thought I want to study Shakespeare because I've seen people who do PhDs on, really quite bad authors who at the end of the 4 years think, that wasn't really worth my time. And I thought, I'm never going to think that about Shakespeare. Clearly, he's always been worth my time. So I thought I want to work on someone I'm completely sure will repay this amount of work. But I think, yeah, I think those are both two good ways of thinking about it. The early modern period, it was just my favorite period. So I didn't really, that wasn't a choice. If you see what I mean, it was just that was the one that I clearly thought was the best. The 1590s is the decade that I particularly love. And I always say to my students, I've got the best authors, we've got Shakespeare and Milton and Spencer.
Yeah.
This is, this is where it's at.
Yeah.
But whichever one, yeah, it's like different. It's really interesting teaching. I see absolutely some people are just because in Oxford we teach this very period-based way. So they all have to study early, middle, and modern. And some of them they just love the 18th century, and that's just it for them. And others, it's the 20th century. And yeah, you get that sense that certain periods just resonate with different people.
That's so interesting. I love that concept of a small topic in a big author or a big topic in a small author. I love that. I think that's a really interesting way of phrasing it. I've never heard that before. I think all of my like successful essays have done that.
Oh,
And I've
great.
never been able to
Yeah.
pinpoint exactly what it is, but I think it is that actually. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, it's a very helpful way of pinning down where you're going. Yeah.
No, definitely. So for my recent, so my master's MPhil dissertation, I did, it was like gender and sexuality and like personhood kind of in Kathy Acker, who is
Mhm.
this really wild experimental 1980s novelist who like fuses drawings and text and prose and poetry all in these tiny little novella-like texts. So I guess she would be classed as more of a small author because there's much less written on her. But then I went into this big rant about subjectivity and
Yeah.
Lacan and the symbolic. So it kind of
Big
are these like
area.
big
Yeah.
ideas.
No,
Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. And so I think
that's
when
really
people are
interesting.
thinking of topics, um, that's really useful because you don't want it too big and you don't want it too small. Um,
Yeah. And also the idea that you want someone who you're not going to hate by the end of it because you're spending so much time with them.
yes.
And you could never hate Shakespeare. So like that's actually perfect.
Exactly same. Although I did have someone who said, "Oh no, that's not the problem. The problem is that you have someone who's not very good, and after studying them for your PhD, you think they are Shakespeare. You think they are the best."
Oh,
That's
that's
true
so
too. You
interesting.
do also get people who go, "The person I've studied this much must be the best person since sliced bread," and then they
That is
find
so,
difficulty.
and they're not. They're actually
And
like
then,
another they
it's like quite minor, and so both are problematic, whichever way you go.
no, definitely. Definitely. Well, I guess Shakespeare, you're not gonna have that problem with.
No, and it's a real one of the real pleasures from teaching is that he's a whole
Yeah.
paper in Oxford. So everybody
Yeah.
else's specialism is an author within a paper, but Shakespeare's his own paper, and that's a real pleasure for teaching.
Yeah. And I think that is actually very fitting because I do feel sometimes when I read Shakespeare that he's almost like 10 different authors wrapped into one, if that makes sense. Like
No,
he has
absolutely.
the history place, he has comedies, he has tragedies, he has these really weird, mystical, fantastical, like Midsummer Night's Dream, spooky fantasy vibe. He has like so many versions of
Yeah,
himself and
yeah,
versions of different worlds.
absolutely.
You know,
And his poetry is very different as well. The authorial voice in the sonnets feels very different from the one in the plays. Um, yeah, yeah.
definitely. Yeah. I wonder, can you set the stage for us, which I think is an apt metaphor, and tell us a bit about some of the key themes at play in early modern literature and drama? So, what do we need to know about what was happening in the early modern period to aptly understand its literature and drama? And how can we then understand some of the major characteristics of this literature and drama? Is there anything political or social, which I'm sure there is, that we as an audience need to know before we delve right in?
Yes, so I would say that I don't think there's anything you need to know. So this is all context enriches the text,
Mm,
and that's absolutely what I work on. So what I love to do is to revive contexts that have been lost. So I wrote a book about the destruction of Jerusalem in early modern literature, and that was a lovely little pathway of just reading this line in Shakespeare where the bastard, he's called the bastard in King John, says, "Let us do like the mutins in Jerusalem." And I thought, what do the mutant, mutins means people who mutiny. What do the people who mutiny in Jerusalem do? I've no idea what they do. And yet clearly a primarily illiterate audience of Shakespeare's plays did know. He didn't need to explain it. And I thought, what is this? So I went and researched and found this sort of big area of um, the way in which this history of Jerusalem was known about at the time and isn't known about now. So that's an example of a sort of a very specific context,
mm,
which I really enjoy reviving and which enriches it, and I understand more as a result of that. But it's not necessary. So I don't think there's anything that's necessary to go into it. There's a definite aspect of just, um, Shakespeare's plays are people behaving in ways that we totally recognize. But that said, the contexts that I think are particularly interesting, I suppose, are religious contexts. So one of them is the advent of Protestantism. And one of the big
mm,
things that led to is a sort of stronger emphasis on the biblical text. So they were more interested in precisely what the Bible said. And therefore, they recognized that people needed to be able to read. So there was a massive increase in literacy at this period, which obviously is central to all the
mm,
text. And one of the things that came from that was a sort of new interest in English itself, a sense that English needed to be expanded to be able to take all different kinds of literature in it, rather than thinking that, you know, scientific literature or certain types of literature will be written in Latin. English has got to be able to sort of hold it all. So a
Mm.
number of poets, and Edmund Spenser's a classic example of this. He's the author of sort of one of England's great epics, The Faerie Queen, expands English. So he takes words from different dialects and tries to make them sort of standard English. He takes loan words from foreign languages and sticks them together to make new words. And Shakespeare's always doing this. He's creating thousands of words. So that's a very interesting part of how sort of vibrant the language feels at this time, as they're sort of creating all these new words. I think this is also centralization, a sort of sense of cities growing. So the growth of London is a big part of what's going on at this time. And that's essential for theatre. So until you get enough people in one place, theatre has to move around. You can't have static theatre because you don't have enough people to come and see your plays. So the
Yeah.
first purpose-built theatre in England is built in 1570 because that's the first time that London's big enough to have enough people with enough leisure, enough money, and just enough people to come and see your plays. So that changes theatre sort of fundamentally from travelling players to a static building and companies that can kind of respond. So it also makes things start becoming more London centric.
Yeah.
It's where they are. So those, I
Yeah.
think, yeah, the sort of flux time. It's a very important time in that's why we talk about it as early modern now, and in the old days they talked about it as Renaissance. This time between something we completely recognize and the medieval period. And I think it's very interesting seeing how medieval aspects play into it. So I'm very interested in the crossover with medieval drama.
Mystery plays, things
Mystery
like that.
plays. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So mystery plays are this wonderful name, and they're called that because they were performed by guilds, which were called mysteries. So there were non-professional actors who performed biblically based cycles all over England. And that's the sort of indigenous English theatre. And obviously there's classical theatre, which we're much more familiar with. But Shakespeare's influenced by both of those strands, and I
Mm.
think that's very interesting. One of the things that interests me is the way in which, for example, uh, mystery plays, because they are religiously based, they are about empathy. You're trying to show Christ's suffering and experience that as your own sin and your own responsiveness to it. Whereas classical theatre famously, sort of puts suffering off stage. So Oedipus blinds himself off stage. Most people die off stage. The affective theatre, where you're meant to feel for the suffering of the characters, is an English thing. It's something coming from the mystery plays, not from classical theatre in the same way. And Shakespeare's sort of visceral response, and the most sort of classic example of that would be Gloucester's blinding in King Lear, which is almost unwatchable, but you are forced to watch it. It is there, and so a lot of the emotional power and the sense of empathy with suffering is from that English tradition, I think.
That is so interesting. I've never thought about how, I guess, the classical plays serve as more of a warning, not exactly to invoke the emotion, but more of like, if you do this, this will happen to you. You're going to end up like Oedipus, you know? Whereas this is actually meant to evoke that despair, and you're going to cry and go through those emotions, not intellectualize it, but feel
No,
it.
that's right, and we would recognize that as more modern. I think that sense that you empathize with the victim, rather than, as you say, a sort of sense that, I mean, obviously there is that empathy in classical drama, but it keeps it at a certain remove. It's something you watch the person who witnessed it, you hear the messenger speech telling you about what happened, and you don't think, this is me. I
Definitely.
did this,
And I
yeah.
think there are so many stage directions in so many of Shakespeare's plays that are just like, he dies, she dies. Like they are dying on the stage, and in classical drama we have way less of that.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a new
You know,
stage direction. I like that.
Yeah, like I'm thinking a lot about that death scene in Hamlet where you have everyone just kind of dying in one scene,
Yeah.
you know,
That's right.
or
And
even
it'd be almost comic if you sort of explained it in separately and said,
yeah,
yeah, this, who's good, when's this going to stop? But when you're watching, it doesn't feel like that.
no, definitely. It feels it actually you're right. It does feel a bit, as you said, like terrifying or horrifying to watch, to have just
Mm.
characters dropping like flies in scene, you
Yeah.
know. No, definitely. Yeah, I would love to speak also a little bit about, as you mentioned, the role of religion in these texts. So we have an emergence of literacy, an emergence of biblical understanding, and this literacy is being driven by the Bible. So what was happening in kind of we kind of touched on in the religious world of early modern England, but I'm curious how it informed these texts. So we'll dive into your book a little bit later about religion in Shakespeare. But did we have to be aware of the Bible to understand certain aspects of these texts? Or, as you said earlier, is it more of a situation where context can inform but is not necessary? Was it really necessary? Like, are you missing out on a lot? Or is it just maybe an extra addition?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I think it's the latter. It's not necessary. It doesn't create a barrier if you don't know these things, but the more you know, the richer it gets.
Right.
And I always find that with my students. Lots of them say, I really think at this point I should know a bit more about the Bible, for not just Shakespeare, for almost all early modern
Yeah.
writers. And some of them do know the Bible very well, and then they have that sort of a sense of awareness of the resonances, some of the deeper things that are going on, the links. But yeah, I mean, Shakespeare alludes to the Bible in sort of recognizable ways over 1,000 times in his plays. So
Wow.
it's a big context, but it's not a
Wow.
necessary context. It's just one of those things that just adds to your enjoyment of it, I think.
No, definitely. I remember in my school, not even university, in my school, in my English class, we had to read the Bible because our teachers believed, not the entire, but like many books of the Bible, because our teachers believed that it cropped up in so many texts that we would be studying that year, that it was the first unit before we studied anything else. We had to read because
That's
of all
great.
the
Yeah, no, I think
allusions.
that's an excellent response. Um, I'm very impressed by
Yeah,
your teachers, and that's
yeah,
great that you did. And
they
it's,
really,
it,
they were
it
correct.
yeah, and once you've got it, you see it. Obviously, all of English literature is also based on older literature. So you have the medieval stuff is obviously based on this, and then later authors are all using Shakespeare. So even when you get to modern authors where it's much less important, you still miss things if you don't know the biblical context at all.
Definitely. And I think there are so many, as you were saying, Shakespeare's dynamics and relationships are recognizable in us and how we treat each other, even in the modern age, 500 years later. And I think also a lot of the Bible's situational kind of circumstances and relationships, like you have the brothers deceit with Cain and Abel, and then you have that in Hamlet, you have that in so many other instances. Like it kind of all
Absolutely.
comes from the Bible.
Absolutely. And yeah, so Shakespeare, obviously we might say that something like sibling jealousy is just an innate human condition. And the Bible presents that with the story of Cain and Abel. And as you say, absolutely in Hamlet, he says this is the primal eldest curse. This is the first murder, is a brother and a brother, and that's what I've done. Absolutely. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember that speech. I think it's also in Hamlet where Eve and the serpent crops up with the poison, and there's that pointing to the image of the serpent, the image of death
Yeah,
and
that's
poison and
right. That's right. The
temptation.
serpent that took your father's life now wears his crown. It's a fantastic
Exactly.
image. And the serpent whispering in the ear. So there's weird things going on in Hamlet with the ears, how important the ears are. And there are again sort of, I don't know that this is definitely a source, but it definitely feels like this idea of the sort of poison in the ear. In one of the mystery plays, Satan becomes a toad and whispers in Eve's ear. And I
Interesting.
can't help feeling there's something going on that. And that definitely turns up in Paradise Lost. Milton uses that image of Satan as a toad, which is not biblical. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
it's interesting, I guess, just to think about the idea of consumption and like kind of ingesting through the mouth and hearing through the ear, and how there may be kind of parallel because ears hear, the mouth tastes or consumes.
And
So it's
also, I mean,
almost
so this is an example, we are talking about Protestantism earlier coming in. A lot of Protestant sort of imagery and propaganda at this period was very intent on ears. So it had this thing about Catholicism. It would present Catholicism as the religion of the eye. It's what you see. So this
mm,
visual panoply, the sort of beauty of the Mass and the beauty of the painted churches and all that. And Protestantism was very sort of down on that and said, you know, the purity comes through the ears, and there's a biblical verse about um, faith coming through hearing. So they were very focused on the word as spoken, so particularly by preachers, so the sense that just
mm,
reading it isn't as strong as hearing someone else preach or read it. So that I think is also relevant to all those ears in Hamlet, because obviously Hamlet is very much a play based on this change. So this generational change between father and son is related to a religious generational change. So the famous thing about, you know, Hamlet's father is in purgatory, which is no longer exists in Elizabethan England.
oh,
Rejected
that
it.
is so
Yeah, so that gives a very strong sense of this relationship between Hamlet and his father, that Hamlet goes to Wittenberg, he goes to Protestant university, so that sense of a generational um, shift being stronger at this time. That sort of, if you have the Catholic, so just like Shakespeare probably had a Catholic father, literally, um, that sense of, you know, a universal human difference between generations being crystallized by this religious change. Hamlet seemed to go in on that. And I do think, I can't remember, I think it was 24 years in Hamlet or something. I do think there is a Protestant angle to that.
That is so interesting. So would you say that, I mean, I think we have a lot of ghosts in throughout Shakespeare's works. We have Banquo, we have Hamlet's father. Is Shakespeare positioning himself in a more Catholic light because he has these people stuck in purgatory in between life and
Yeah.
death?
So this is a definite question. Plenty of people have sort of thought Shakespeare is Catholic. I think it's perfectly plausible in the sense of what he really believed, but we can't know what he really believed. There's no evidence of that. We know he
Yeah.
conformed to the church. He baptized his children in the Church of England. He definitely conformed. Whether the Catholic aspects of his play, so having these ghosts coming from purgatory, there are lots of other ones. There are wayside crosses that Portia prays by. For example, you just think wayside crosses. This feels really extreme. Some of it is just these are set in foreign countries. You know, there's a lot of Italian settings for
True.
Shakespeare's plays,
True.
so it might be just sort of local color. Um, there might just be the sense these are old stories. A lot of them obviously, are Catholic stories. He's the sense of the narrative as being sort of naturally Catholic, that sort of works well as a storytelling device.
Mm,
He's It's not just that though. He has these, you know, for example, good-hearted friars. So the friar in Romeo and Juliet is a bit of a disaster. You know, he just done better and got the letter on time, the death wouldn't happen. But there's no question that he's trying to be good. He's trying to bring these two families together through the medium of these young people's love. Is a very positive aim. And most friars in early modern drama are kind of evil and conniving and dodgy foreigners. So he's definitely got a sympathy for Catholic imagery and ideas, which is anathema to most early modern playwrights. So that definitely is interesting. The question is whether, you know, if you're interested in his own beliefs, then say, what does that prove his own beliefs, or is it just that he recognizes that for drama, this works really well?
it's helpful. Yeah. No, interesting. So at the time, were Catholics being prosecuted or did that happen later?
No, no,
They
it
were.
happened already, yes. So under Elizabeth, Elizabeth is a bit careful. So before Elizabeth comes to the throne, we have her sister Mary, who pursued a very aggressive religious policy and you know, executed, burnt a lot of people for being Protestants. Elizabeth is a bit careful to try not to sort of divide the nation more than it needs to be, but it's still illegal to be Catholic, basically. So one of the things is that you have to go to church. It's illegal not to go to church, which now seems so weird to us. But that was partly to do with the fact that that sort of showed a national conformity. You're doing what you're told. The church was the way in which the government would give information. So if we were at war or whatever, that information would come through being announced at church. So you want somewhere, the government wants somewhere where everyone can definitely hear what's going on.
Definitely.
So yeah, so that it was illegal not to go to church, but you weren't executed, you were just fined. So Elizabeth sort of does a sort of clever policy of sort of long-term attrition, basically, where it's a really unpleasant level of fine. Nobody who is not rich could possibly pay it. Rich people could pay it, and some did, and that's why we have a sort of tradition of sort of Catholic aristocracy in England, is that some people, the people who are incredibly wealthy, would have been able to keep paying this money. But 10 years of spending thousands and thousands of pounds, and it's not martyrdom, it's not sort of heroic, it just really grinds you down and think, "Argh." So I think a lot of
It's
people just
almost
ended up
passive. It's more passive, isn't it?
exactly.
Yeah.
And you can go to church and not take communion. So this is the important thing. You are not forced to do something that's against your beliefs. And so people just started going to church and not taking communion. And they were called church papists was a name for them at the time. And so the question of how many people are doing that is not clear. And it's clearly, it's quite a lot. But part of the success for the Elizabethan church is just how long Elizabeth lived. So it just becomes, from she becomes queen in 1558. She doesn't die till 1603. So there's a long period where even if you were Catholic at the beginning, if you spent 20, 30 years going to church and not taking communion, eventually probably you just, your children just become Anglicans or Church of
That's
England.
really interesting.
So she
Yeah.
did a very clever. It's a famous phrase. I do not want to make windows into men's souls. She's like, I don't care what you really believe. I just care that you conform and you obey your government. And so it was a clever process for basically in the end just sort of enculturating her form of Christianity. But it was so it was illegal, and there were obviously these sort of heroic Catholic priests who, if they were found, would be executed. And that was going on in this period. But that,
Yeah.
it's a very small number of people who could afford to carry on.
To not go.
Not go. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we hear that and we're like, oh my goodness, it's illegal to not go to church. What is that all about? But I think we have to remember equally at the time, there was no, if we're going to war, there was no Apple News alert on your phone. There was no Twitter, we're at war. There weren't any newspaper updates, any magazine updates, any Daily Mail app on your phone, nothing like that. So
Yeah.
if there was a national announcement that had to be made, or even a village or a town or anything, the church was the place to go. It was almost like a hub of social and political information.
Exactly. And so, one example would be plague. So if you've got an outbreak of plague, you need a sort of sense that where people know it's happening, and whatever
No,
orders
definitely.
go through. Yeah. So absolutely. It's essential for the government to be able to contact people, and that's the only clear way they can do it. Yeah.
Definitely. So I would love to turn to your book, Texts and Traditions, Religion and Shakespeare, 1592 to 1604. So that favorite decade that you were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in your book, you write, quote, many biblical allusions in Shakespeare are seamlessly integrated into the text, and it is difficult to tell whether he or his audience were aware of them. Although as Shakespeare's audience was part of only the second generation to whom an English Bible was accessible, its language would not yet have become simply proverbial. So you also say that jokes and puns would make no sense without the biblical context, which finds, quote, Shakespeare consciously using biblical quotation and holding up biblical illiteracy, for example, confusing Judas Maccabeus with Judas Iscariot, as something which can destroy theatrical presentation. unquote. So, how important is the role of the Bible in Shakespearean drama, and how would the audience be interacting with these biblical allusions? For example, was Shakespeare genuinely communicating to the audience that the Bible was this important holy text for everyone in the audience to read? Was it more of a playful thing? We spoke a bit about how context can enrich, but what was he really doing with these biblical jokes, puns, constantly dropping it in to having read the Bible and actually read the words, not paraphrase, but actually having read the words to understand the joke?
Yes, absolutely. So the reason I picked up on the jokes and puns is not that his jokes and puns usually are biblical, but that those are examples where we can see that he's definitely intending a allusion and that he's expecting the audience to get it, because a number of the allusions they're just part of the texture of the language, you wouldn't necessarily notice. But in a joke, you must. So when this is the bit you're talking about is from Love's Labour's Lost, where they're performing Judas Maccabeus, and someone says, they're talking about kissing and saying Judas Maccabeus clipped is plain Judas. Clipped means kiss. So he's saying if you cut off the Maccabeus, you just get Judas. But he's making the point that Judas kisses Jesus, is very famous, the Judas kiss. So then you know that that biblical reference is intended because it's in a joke. So that's why I've focused on jokes. But I don't think I was also making the point that I think it would be more audible to the audience than it is now because it's quite new. So I think we forget how new the Bible in English was at this period. It's really only with Elizabeth coming to the throne in 58 that it becomes commonplace. So there had been an English Bible for quite some time. Tyndale translates it, and there's an English Bible that's sort of official under Henry VIII called the Great Bible. But Henry VIII he's not really a Protestant Henry VIII, so he does end up just thinking, no, let's not do that again. It makes it illegal to read the Bible in English. And then we have Mary, who obviously carries on with that. So it's only really in Elizabethan England that the full scale rollout of an English Bible happens. So phrases like, sign of the times is a phrase from Tyndale's translation of the Bible. When anyone uses that now, they have no idea that they're quoting the Bible. But I think that might not have been the case.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they might have thought in Shakespeare's time, but they might have heard it a bit more then. So that's one of the things I was saying, that things that are occluded to us might have been much more audible to Shakespeare's audience. But again, I don't think any of this is necessary. I think it just adds something, but you don't need to know, except possibly with the Judas Maccabean joke where you just think, who is Judas Maccabean? What's going on here? Generally, it's all seamlessly involved. So it adds something. So a nice example that I like is when Macbeth leaves Duncan's table and is thinking about killing him. He says, if it were done when it is done, 'twere well it were done quickly. And that's an echo of Jesus' words to Judas, where he says, that thou doest, do quickly. So both the sort of emphasis on the doing, the done, which is sort of slightly obsessive with Macbeth's case, and the do it quickly, align Macbeth absolutely with Judas. So both the situation does, because he's at a meal with Duncan, and he's leaving it and going out into the night, which is what happens at the Last Supper. Judas leaves and goes out into the night. So you get a very strong Judas feel there, and I think it really helps with the sort of uncanny feeling and this is definitely don't do it, but that he will do it, and that it's not sort of that's that slightly fateful feel to it. Add something,
almost inscribed in history, like this will
exactly.
happen. It
It
already
feels
happened.
inescapable. That's right. So it works very nicely with the sense of the witches of is he pulled down this path, or does he have true volition?
Definitely. And so in the Bible, does Jesus say, do it quickly?
Yes, he does. Yeah.
So that's really interesting, because in a way, because Judas is the one leaving and Macbeth is the one leaving. So physically, he's aligned with Judas because he's leaving this meal in which Duncan is Jesus. However, he speaks Jesus's words, so it's almost that kind of pointing to he thinks he's Jesus. He really thinks he should be doing this. He thinks he's Jesus, but he's not.
Maybe he's
Physically,
no, that's it. And maybe I suppose, yes, that sense of which Jesus is in control. So I think one of the reasons he says that is this sense that the Bible doesn't want to have Jesus kind of being out of control of this situation. The Bible doesn't want Jesus to be ambushed by this. He wants this sense that he's actually in control and that he's giving himself up. Um, and Macbeth's, I suppose, is taking over those words partly as a sort of illusion that he's in control. But the illusion itself signals that he's not, or at least that he's definitely, if he were in control, he should definitely stop. But yeah, it's a very interesting line from
definitely,
either way, from Jesus, that sense of
definitely.
is this something Judas really is able not to do?
It's an interesting dynamic because it almost positions Macbeth as someone who's trying to evoke Jesus. He wants to say Jesus's words. He thinks maybe he is carrying out the good deed that needs to be done for history, for himself. He's trying to cling to this sense of goodness and no, I'm good, I'm going to say his words. I'm Jesus, but
He wants to believe in
physically
himself. Yeah. No, I think
physically he's carrying out Judas's
no,
actions.
and it's difficult for him to claim. I think this is sort of as, in any sense, self-sacrificial action. So it's definitely for his own
Definitely,
advantage only. He doesn't. He
definitely,
doesn't really try and make any claim that it might be. Scotland needs me as king. It'll be held. I don't think he ever makes that claim. But yeah, there's a lot
indeed.
of religious language being used in the wrong way. So there's another great one from the Psalms. When they first see Macbeth's castle, one of the longest ever psalm parallels in Shakespeare, where he describes how beautiful the castle is and that the birds are nesting in it. And that's a description of the temple in the Psalms where it says, the temple is so peaceful that the birds come and nest in it. So again, it's just a wrong image. It's just no, this is not what's going to happen at the castle. But that, yeah, that's sort of in both cases just this irony of it's the wrongness of the biblical allusion. And so we were asking earlier about, is it prescriptive or playful? Basically, I think it's always playful. Shakespeare's never actually talking about the Bible. He's never examining the truth
Mhm.
claims of the Bible. The Bible is simply taken as the text. It's the thing it's there, it's true, it's right. It's not being investigated. He's simply using it as something. How this story goes. You know that Jesus is bad. Jesus is in control in the situation that Judas is wrong. You know this story, so he's mapping his own story onto it. Um, I think something that really interests me is this idea of shared text. And the Bible is a shared text like no other, and particularly at this time when most people are illiterate. So most people can't read, and everybody has to go to church. And at church, you hear the Bible every
Mhm.
week of your life. So people knew the Bible extraordinarily well. They're also incredibly good at remembering things. So it is the case that now with literacy, your knowledge of what you can remember goes down. um,
That's so interesting. Yeah,
you
that
don't
is so
need to
true.
be able to remember it. So their memories are so good. It's quite interesting looking at theatre, for example, the number of plays that people could put on simultaneously, meaning that all the actors had to remember, 10 different roles. Modern actors couldn't do that. So even people who are incredibly good at remembering text are not as good at remembering text as they were. So this idea that it's unlike all Shakespeare's other sources. So you might say something like, his the histories that he's taking from histories of England, these are quite well known. They're quite well known, but they're nothing like the Bible in terms of their reach. So he is going for both the most sort of powerful text of his period, but also the one that unites everybody. All his audience would know this text. They would all know Judas. They would all know that Judas kisses Jesus, and that's a betrayal. Shakespeare has about 3, 4 times where he talks
Yeah.
about a kiss as a betrayal, and that everybody knows where that's from.
Yeah, that is because I was going to ask how, like, roughly what percent of the audience would be clued in on these references, and you're saying quite a large percent.
I think it's all of them. Yeah,
Really?
absolutely. For the
Wow.
main, so there might be, the Psalm reference might not be everybody, um, but a sort of basic Christian story, um, I think it's everybody. So I think that, the Cain and Abel, or
Yeah.
kind of, big biblical stories, I think everybody knew them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how there is that divide happening at the time between Catholicism and Protestantism, where you have the difference between ingesting or consuming and whispering. For example, the serpent whispering in the ear is a new way of being tempted, not biting the apple, but actually the serpent speaking to you. You have that kind of, so they're almost like two religions warring against the public, essentially. And I guess that has a lot of repercussions in the text and how the text were to be interpreted. If you're Catholic versus Protestant, you have potentially a different relationship to these biblical stories and these allusions, I
Yes,
would think.
I think that's true, but I think it is also a common text.
Yeah,
So that's an interesting thing, because they're not different religions in that sense. They're both biblically based.
true.
So it is something that unites people, as well as is the importance of the Bible, the importance of the story. So some of these things get you back to something that's common between everybody who's Christians, or everyone who's English at the time. So I think there is that aspect as well. And I think
Yeah.
Shakespeare is not that divisive on the whole. So he's got a few bits where he is rude about Puritans, because Puritans don't like the theatre, so that's fair, fair enough. Um, but on the whole, and again, compared to a lot of other early modern drama, they're not that divisive characters. He's generally looking for consensus, I'd say.
Yeah. It was really interesting what you were saying about him using expressions of goodness or, moral characters like Jesus, not characters, I guess he is a really real person, but situations in which morality and goodness are upheld, he actually puts them in the mouths of, these evil characters or morally corrupt characters and morally corrupt locations like the castle. Is he pointing to the fact that something wrong is occurring and something is not quite connecting? Is he suggesting that these characters are trying to uphold moral standards and still think of themselves as moral? Like, I know Macbeth does struggle with his morality throughout the play, and he keeps trying to stick to this image of himself as a good person. And I think he, throughout the play, is less and less able to justify that conception of himself. I think he initially genuinely does want to be a good person,
Mm.
but he can't. He gets to a point where he cannot conceive of himself in that way anymore. And he's, of course, his wife is slowly chipping away at that image of himself. So is he trying to stick to the good side? Is that what Shakespeare is implying he's doing, or is that not
Yeah, I
on
would
his?
have to, you'd have to go through the one about the castle is not Macbeth himself, it's other people describing the castle. So that would be a sense of just the irony, I think.
Or
Um,
his words, where he's putting Jesus's words in his own
but
mouth?
I do like that idea, and I do think the sense of a sort of self-deception is definitely present. So you have someone like Richard III, who doesn't have any self-esteem. Richard III knows exactly what he's doing. So this person takes sort of satanic archetypes and is quite happy with them. And Iago would be another one. So Iago has a famous line. He says, "I am not that I am." And those are God's words in Exodus when he speaks to Moses in the burning bush. But Moses says to him, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God says, "I am." So I am that I am, he says. So God expresses his nature as being that which is. And Iago expresses his nature as being that which is not. I am not that I am. So he is actually sort of satanic speech, taking God's self-naming and inverting it. And that's very much fits with Iago being quite happy with his sort of satanic position. He's like, he does no self illusions about how he is. And I think you're
Mm.
right that Macbeth is not like either of those. He does want to believe himself as good, while
I think he's delusional.
yeah, delusional, but also difficult. You know, it's
In,
difficult position to uphold once you've murdered someone. But he is, yeah, he does sort of want to try and to do that, and Claudius has that as well in Hamlet. So obviously we see him trying to pray
right.
and
Yes.
recognizing that he can't pray um, because he won't give up. He won't truly repent. So it's like if I wanted to be able to pray, I would have to give up the crown and my queen because that's why I committed the murder, and I can't pray until I've done that because I can't actually repent. So he's aware of it as well, and he is. He wants to be able to repent. He does want to be good, but he recognizes that he can't be. And I think Macbeth is not as clear as Claudius. He hasn't spelled it out to himself in quite so clear a way. But yeah, he is conflicted. So I like, I do like that idea. Um, Shakespeare does use sort of these Christ images often of more sort of simply pure people. And one of the things I really like is there's often female characters. So Desdemona would be a classic example, but also Hermione in Winter's Tale is one of the strongest. So he takes a sort of goodness that in the mystery plays and things might often be more linked to a sort of Virgin Mary archetype, but actually gives them Christic images. So I would say his Christic image is more often used of purely good people, but it is interesting when someone like Macbeth takes it for himself.
Definitely. And I think it really shows the will behind the character, that this constant will that he's trying to kind of push himself into this mold, but he's just not that mold, you
And
know?
I think
Um,
the character who does this most clearly is Richard II. So Richard II, and that is it's easier because of the kingship Christic archetype. So there was a sort of strong sense of a divine right of kings, meaning that kingship felt like a Christic sort of position that a human being might invoke. So Macbeth obviously is trying to grab himself kingship. So in some ways that works quite nicely with your point.
that's true.
Um, but
Yeah,
Richard II does a lot, they say, all hail to me, as Judas did to Christ. He makes it explicit. And again, that's fun because actually Judas doesn't say all hail in the Bible. That's a mystery play phrase. And again, it's a strong one in Shakespeare. He often has Judas saying all hail. Um,
interesting.
so yeah, and I think it's delusional for Richard II too. And the fact that he finds these parallels suitable is a big is a big downer on him as a character. But Shakespeare doesn't make it. He does allow him a sort of quite a strong death. So basically, he takes these Christic parallels when he's in his pomp, and they are ironized by the play. But when he has everything stripped and he's in a genuinely sort of humble position, there's a sense in which they sort of come back with a bit more power.
Definitely. I want to just quickly turn to, before we delve into Harry Potter, just and then we'll close. I don't want to keep you for too long. I apologize. I was really interested in what you were saying about female characters, and I think female characters in Shakespeare, I find them absolutely fascinating because we have a few different. I would say we have a few different, not stereotypical kinds of characters, but there are a few different versions of characters that crop up, I think, throughout the plays. For example, we have women that are desired objectively by everyone, the Biancas and the Hermias of the plays that are just beautiful and funny and outgoing, and everyone loves them, right? These kinds of playful women. And then you
Mm.
have these kinds of depressed, melancholic women like Helena, like I would say Ophelia as well. And I think Shakespeare deals with his female characters in a really interesting way. I wouldn't say that it's overtly misogynistic, which I think a lot of male authors do treat women that way, especially the earlier you go. Kind of timeline wise. But I would love to hear what you think about Shakespeare's female. I know it's a very broad question, but some of your thoughts on Shakespeare's female characters and the association with kind of, the phallic symbol and the nothingness of the female, anatomy. They're often associated with the word nothing, or I say nothing, I am nothing. But yeah, sorry, it was a very, very vague question, but
So that's okay.
Shakespeare.
So
Yeah.
on the nothing, yeah, so that's just the misogyny present in the language at the time.
Yeah.
So they're very strong on that, and that is in when Ophelia and Hamlet are talking together just before the play within a play. So they're sort of in the court setting. Possibly everyone can hear what they're saying. You can stage it in different ways, but she says this thing, nothing, and he says that's a fair thought to lay between her legs, and she's like, you're naught. I said, do you think I mean country matters? And you're like, my goodness, Hamlet, this is outrageous. To be talking in such explicit terms to Ophelia, and particularly if it's sort of public. And yeah, so at that point, I think, Hamlet is incredibly misogynistic in his language, and that is absolutely present throughout Shakespeare, that sort of reference to the O, the cipher, much ado about nothing might be taken that way as well. But I don't think that's particularly specific to Shakespeare. That's present in the language at the time. But I think one of the things I really like about a number of his female characters is this sense of female desire as an empowered thing. So we often, feel in modernity that until recently, women were just expected to be objects of desire, and the sort of desiring subjectivity of a number of his characters is really satisfying in terms of they get what they want and they're in charge. That's very attractive in some of his characters. So Rosalind would be the classic one, as you like it, that she's in charge of that play. She has a similar sort of power over the play as Prospero does in The Tempest. And this is sort of shown in the epilogue where she's takes over the epilogue, just like Prospero's fantastic epilogue at the end of The Tempest. And she organizes everything. She gets other people paired up as they should be, as well as getting what she wants. So she's a fantastic example of sort of the witty female, sort of traditional character of getting what she wants. There's an interestingly more equivocal one in All's Well That Ends Well. So Helena, in that, similarly, she falls in love with a man who's not in love with her. She manages to force him to marry her by curing the King of France and getting the King of France to just say, Bertram, you have to marry her. That's the end of that. What in a modern time, obviously we see this as an abuse of power, is like, Bertram's horrible, but you're not allowed to just marry people against their will, even if they're horrible men. The play is on, I would say, Helena's side. We're always meant to think that she's great and Bertram is ghastly for not wanting her, because it's just a sort of classist thing. He's just like, she's just beneath me, But I do think it's not just the modern sensibility that sees a problem with that. So it is interesting to have a desiring female subject who is actually problematic in the sense in which she makes what she wants happen without any real so she's a really interesting, and again, I would say people find quite a modern idea, but mostly they're more the Rosalind tips. So Imogen in Cymbeline is another one of these. Imogen is kind of completely perfect woman. She marries someone against her father's, so someone she shouldn't really be marrying. She's separated from him. The women never have a class-based idea of who they desire. They just desire who they desire. And she gets what she wants, and she's, again, sort of in control. And she's less powerful than Rosalind in sort of making it happen, but the similarity that the play works with her desires to get back to where they should always have been. And then I suppose Juliet is the classic one as well, that it's Juliet who proposes to Romeo. She's like, basically, that's, if we're going to take this on, I'm going to send them tomorrow. We'll get married, and you're like, this is quite radical. To have a woman proposing at that in that period, and from the sort of hardly knowing each other, and again, Juliet seems to me a perfect character in that she is someone who does exactly what she wants. She proposes marriage, she goes against her father's wishes, she does things that the patriarchy of the time would have been very uncertain about, and the play is absolutely on her side. She is, her morality is underlined by the nurse. So nurse is another great female character when the nurse goes, oh, Romeo is great and all that, but Paris is, great too. I'd just marry him, and just commit bigamy. Why not? And Juliet's absolutely appalled. So she withdraws. She goes, I'm not going to trust the nurse ever again. If she could say something like that, and she just sort of withdraws. So the sense in which Juliet is just sort of morally more correct than all the adults around her is very
No,
strong.
definitely.
So yeah, I think he doesn't have as many female characters as male. And yes, there are a number of sort of unbelievably perfect ones that I feel is a bit too strong. But there's some great great desiring females who are correct
Definitely.
to desire the players up in favor of. A nice example of this, just a little example of sort of overturning some medieval types of misogyny. So there's the classic medieval fablio, which is often about wives who are having affairs. And it's really worth, so the sort of classic bit of misogyny is just a sense that you can't trust your wife. She's always off having sex behind your back. And there is no example of that in Shakespeare. There are masses of women in Shakespeare who their husbands think are doing this. So Desdemona, Imogen, it's a sort of a classic form and Hermione, sort of pregnant woman, and the husbands are always wrong. So the misogyny is always unjustified, and it runs the gamut from people you're quite sympathetic towards, like Othello, who's been, completely forced into this position by someone else. He shouldn't have gone there, but you can see why someone was really actively pursuing that. Whereas a number of the other husbands, Posthumus doesn't really have any legitimacy for sort of staking his wife's purity in a bet. You're like, what are you doing, Posthumus? What is this? And then in Winter's Tale, the husband has just come out of nowhere. It's just a completely weird belief. But the men are always in the wrong. And so that's a nice overturning of sort of classic misogynistic trope.
Definitely. And I think one of my favorite examples of the desiring female subject is in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where the women in that play are just just wreaking havoc on everyone, I think. And I think Titania is just one of my favorite characters in Shakespeare, actually, where she's this ultimate powerhouse, where she is kind of very much behind her own desire, behind her own actions. She's mad at her husband, so she goes and makes someone a donkey and falls, or she doesn't make someone, but she
Yeah.
falls in love with the donkey.
I I mean, she's a good example of what you could say, so one of these with plays is they have no narrative voice. So you can't say exactly, what is Shakespeare doing here? You have to say, what does the play do? And so we have Oberon, who unacceptably, thinks that he can spike his wife's drink and sort of get involved in a date rape situation. And the play turns that around, So, okay, he's a donkey, he's bottom, but she is having a fantastic time. And Oberon is completely, his evil plans have been, he's like, I'm going to undo this. I don't like the sight of my wife enjoying having sex with someone else. This was a mistake. And so, yes, the play is definitely against this male sexual control of women. I agree. I think also this sense in which the play reestablishes the sort of patriarchal situation. So again, there's a fantastic, unusual female situation there of Titania having a votaress, a woman who loves her, who is pregnant and who dies in childbirth, and then therefore she gives the child to Titania. So Titania takes over. So again, an entirely sort of female situation. There are no men present. You're looking after the child of another woman. And Oberon
And
wants
Oprah
the
hates that.
Oberon
He hates
wants the he hates it. He destroys it, and I'm afraid he wins in the play. He gets the little boy at the end, but I don't think we feel he's right to do so. Obviously, we don't now, but
no.
I don't think you'd ever have felt that he's played fair. That he should have done. So I think the play shows you the reality of male power and the fact that Oberon gets what he wants. Um, but it definitely questions it. It definitely suggests not only does he do so in a dodgy way, but that he shouldn't, shouldn't do this at all. That the boy should have stayed with Titania.
Definitely. And I also really love the kind of playing around with the idea of desire and love as something that I kind of view as the play suggesting as commodifiable. In this little flower, you're able to make anyone desire vehemently, anyone love. And whether that is, goes along with who they truly love, or turns who you love to love you back, or just completely confuses everyone, as is what happens with the four lovers. I really love what Shakespeare is doing with that flower and its significance. How do you view what's happening with that and the commodification of desire into this little tool?
Yeah,
Um,
it is an interesting one, and I think the question is partly what has happened under the love potion.
mm,
When they reawaken, Demetrius, Lysander and Hermia are back together as they should have been. But Demetrius says, I've realized I am in love with Helena. And so the flower has done something there of putting people back at the right pairs, but it's not clear how or why, given that he's just been spending the time under the love potion, sort of, yeah, that was fake. And so why is this real feeling for Helena occurred? And I don't think it's explained or sort of properly properly worked out.
I to this
What
day don't
what's a
understand
happy
it.
ending? Yeah. There's another thing that happens parallel with that at that moment, which is that Theseus says, I'm just going to overgo you, Aegean. Yeah, Hermia and Lysander can marry. And that's, I'm just going to make that happen. You think, wait a moment. At the beginning of this play, you said you couldn't. You said that you
She was
didn't
on
agree with Aegean, but you couldn't
exactly.
overgo her father's wishes. She had to either marry the man she didn't love or become a nun. And if you could have said this then, why didn't you say it then? And I think when you watch the play, you simply don't think like that. So the first time you're there, you just go along, this is the happy ending. We know this is all going to turn
Right,
right. And we don't go, wait a moment, if you had this power now, you also had it at the
right,
beginning of the play. So it works neatly, the love potion and the sort of um, love versus law dynamic. So this is a classic comedy dynamic where law is overturned by young
right.
people.
For love.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Love is a trial. And that's what happens in Romeo and Juliet initially, but then obviously fails. So you have a sort of, there's a author called Susan Schneider who talks about the comic matrix of Shakespeare's tragedies, in particular Romeo and Juliet, and that's absolutely exactly right. There's a comic form. So Midsummer Night's Dream is the comic form where law is just overturned without any explanation. And I think Demetrius's change of heart is part of that. In a recent production in the Globe, they had um, Helena as a man, so that Demetrius is sort of, when he has the change of heart, he's accepting a same-sex attraction that he wasn't previously willing to accept. And I did think that worked very nicely for what, how is it that Demetrius could really have been in love with Helena all along? The play doesn't really, he was, then
Right.
he could have just gone with it at the beginning. There's no reason
Exactly.
for him to not so to have an internal reason why he was unhappy to accept this relationship, which he can then
Exactly.
overturn by the time in the forest. That I think that worked very well as an interpretation of it.
Definitely. It actually makes a lot more sense because then there's a reason that he is effectively denying his true self. He's trying to push his self away. but at the end he comes to accept his true self, and that I think makes more sense than Demetrius having this sudden change of heart for someone that he, was disgusted by initially, but
Yeah.
then eventually falls in love with. I do think as well what we were saying about female desire winning out in the end, and the females getting their true desire. They're chasing this man, and they actually obtain, or for so to speak, they actually get to be with him. Is kind of what happens with Helena, someone who did not want to be with her very much.
Absolutely.
She ends up marrying him, and
No,
her female desire is satiated in that relationship.
and we have to
Um,
hope that he has had a change of heart for her. Yeah,
exactly.
this also happens in Measure for Measure. So Measure for Measure, there's a character called Mariana who is in love with Angelo, who is just um, unacceptable person in every sense. I once gave a talk at a among sort of people who hadn't read the play before, so I did a quick sort of plot synopsis, and one of the audience just I said, uh, Angelo says that he won't kill her brother if she sleeps with him, and then he thinks she slept with him, and he kills her brother anyway. And she's supposed to, what's a rotter? Yeah, no, you've absolutely got it. That's absolutely what Angelo is. He's an utter rotter. Um, why Mariana's in love with him is completely unclear, but she's completely in love with him, and she has this wonderful phrase at the end when she is married to him against his will again, and she says, I want no other nor no better man. This is the one I want. And so Mariana gets absolutely what she wants, despite the fact that we can't as an audience feel that this is a good choice on her role, and we can just hope that Angelo has a change of heart. But it is quite interesting to have a character like that who is absolutely certain about what she wants, however much everyone else is thinking it's a terrible decision, Mariana.
Definitely, definitely, yeah. He really is giving female characters what they desire. Shakespeare is a feminist.
Yeah, you would have not. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Okay, so quickly before we close, I really would love to turn to your book, Literary Allusions in Harry Potter, because it's too amazing not to talk about. So this book focuses on drawing comparisons between Harry Potter and other texts, kind of what we were touching on earlier about intertextuality, how texts kind of talk to each other, how texts mimic each other and pull, whether that's a plot structure or the actual phrases themselves or naming or things like that. And so it pinpoints allusions from the classical world to the modern age, and it draws incredible conclusions from these that shine a new light on Rowling's texts. So a lovely review by Michelle Danielle Castleman calls this book a, quote, thoughtful monograph that draws attention to the intertextual connections within the Western literary tradition, which I think is a great way of summarizing this text. So what was the process like researching for this book? Was the magic in Harry Potter still there? Was it stronger once you finished it? Once you saw all these different kind of connections to text? Or what was the process like? How did you find it? And why did you choose to undertake this very different project?
Yeah, that's it. It is a very different project. Although I do looking for connections, I do think
Yeah,
this is a shared text that just as the Bible was the shared text for
definitely.
Shakespeare generation, that does feel like Harry Potter is a shared text for our
Yeah.
generation. It is extraordinary. It's
No,
global
it's
reach.
yeah,
So I'm interested in those kind of texts. So that
yeah,
was a sort of connection, and yeah, illusion is relevant to both. I
yeah,
started off on the project because of reading the first one and coming across the cat, Mrs. Norris. And I thought
yes,
this is an allusion to Mansfield Park. There are not very many Mrs. Norrises around. This is certainly an allusion to Mansfield Park. And I was just so surprised. I think it's a children's novel with a reference to Mansfield Park in it.
yeah,
And I really enjoyed it. But I just thought I'd look a bit more. And I was thinking about writing a much shorter book, just bringing it this kind of thing to light. But Jane Austen is sort of my favorite novelist, and she's also Rowling's favorite novelist. So that
yeah.
was where it started from. And I just thought I'll just write on all the Austen connections I can find and then see where we are. And I sort of wrote 10,000 words just on Austen connections and thought, oh, maybe there's more, there's more here. I hadn't
Oh,
really. read any of her interviews before starting on this book. So that was one thing, was going into them and finding that she consciously references Austen as one example, but lots of others. So she's mentioned a lot of authors in her interviews. So that sort of started me off on thinking that there was more to follow up. And Macbeth, she talks about the prophecy in Phoenix as being the Macbeth thing of, does the
Yeah,
prophecy make them do it or not? With Austen, she talks about the way in which she's interested in the twist. So both of them, the authors, like pulling the wool over their readers' eyes. Both of them write sort of mystery type plots without being mystery novels. And Rowling has come out now and is now complete writes detective novels. But the fact that she wanted to do something, she loves that form, is obviously already present in Harry Potter. But when you read the first one, you don't realize that's what you're getting. You're not expecting it not to be Snape. You don't realize you're reading a novel with a twist.
definitely.
And she says, I'll never be able to do that as well as Austen did in Emma. So that's her favorite
Wow.
novel. So it works at sort of period of plot as well, the sort of the style of, not bringing the reader in without realizing that what they're getting is a twist type of story.
Definitely. It also makes me think of what you were saying about the audience in Shakespeare understanding the illusions. It's
Mhm.
really interesting here because I think a lot of children wouldn't understand these illusions. So she's
No,
almost doing it in order for this series to be timeless for, as we read
I
it
think
again as
that's,
adults.
yeah, I think that's right. I
You
think
know?
they are opposite. Yeah, I think you're right that this is what this is there's a lovely phrase she talks about when people reread them, there'll be another Swede in the bag. So these are not
Exactly.
expected to be seen, and they're waiting, obviously when she the first one, she had no idea she's gonna get masses of adult readers for this book. So it's both a sort of sweet in the bag when you come back to the books as an
Yeah,
adult, but it's also, I think, a sweet in the bag for when you read Mansfield Park as a child. So you're a child, you know Mrs. Norris, and you go, oh, it's a Mrs. Norris. So it works sort of in the opposite way to an allusion to the Bible and Shakespeare, where he's expecting you to know that you're not expected to know it, but you will then meet it when you read, then the next novel. So there's a lovely example of that. In Mayor of Casterbridge in Hardy. And she's talked about the fact that she got the name Dumbledore from Hardy. So a Dumbledore is a Dorset dialect word for a bumblebee. And she's mentioned that. But if you actually go and read the passage in Mayor of Casterbridge, which talks about this, the heroine, Elizabeth Jane, is learning not to use her native dialect. She's trying to unlearn the way she naturally speaks to please her new father, who doesn't like that kind of. So he's basically a sort of Vernon Dursley. He doesn't like her to be her real self. And she says she's learnt not to call Dumbledores but bumblebees. And then she says, and she learned that when she hadn't slept well, not to say that she'd been Hagrid. And so I think she's left this little treat. There's the whole other word. She never mentioned that the word Hagrid is also from the same sentence as the word Dumbledore. So Hagrid was a dialect way of saying you'd had a bad night's sleep, you'd been ridden by a hag.
that
Um,
is amazing. It's genuinely like she's using these, I guess, names and hence their individuals behind, who are their names, Dumbledore and Hagrid, as the physical embodiments of this young girl's fantasy world, and in effect,
But
Harry's
it's not,
fantasy world.
yeah, it's not a fantasy world, it's the real world. So
Yeah,
it's basically it's the native dialect, it's the natural form of her childhood. It's who she really is these fantasy characters. Um, and she's learning to overlay them with a Dursley-like conformity. So it's wonderful, I think, as a metaphor that she's using her magical world is like Elizabeth Jane's dialect, real world, the natural world of her Dorset childhood, what the real thing is, and then it's overlaid with the sort of fake stuff on top.
that is, yeah, it really shows them as heroes. It kind of it characterizes them as childhood heroes and adulthood heroes, by translation, when you actually lean into it and the world becomes real and you grow up in that world. That is, I did not know. That is amazing. Wow, that is
Well,
actually
it's
really
not.
cool.
It's I say it's very clever because she's mentioned the Dumbledore one, so she's mentioned people can go and find it. But yeah, but it's not at all well
But then
known.
Easter eggs.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like,
It's absolutely Easter. It's
yeah.
kind of weird because you're like planting Easter eggs in Hardy, which is
That,
quite surprising. Yeah,
that,
and I I've really enjoyed. So since writing the book, I just kept on blogging. And writing about things. So I found that, the community so welcoming. It's sort of the opposite of normal academia where, when you publish stuff, nothing happens, nobody responds. But in fandom, it's quite different and you get lots of people responding to what you write. So it's really, really fun.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, I've just sort of carried on with this finding new text. So one that I really enjoyed recently was about the white stag.
Mm.
Um, and there's just such a powerful moment. It's one of my favorite moments in the series when the white doe is walking through the Forest of Dean just after Christmas, and Harry sees it and follows it and knows that it's good and knows that it's leading him correctly. And then you get sort of one of the most Arthurian moments of the whole series when he sees the sword in the pool. And you're like, this is very strong. Yeah, the Lady of the Lake
Arthur
giving
vibes,
exact, very strong
definitely.
artifacts. So these are really artifacts. So I thought I'll have a look at the white doe and the white stag. Because one knows those are sort of Arthurian, and at the end of Narnia, there's the hunting of a white stag, and it gives you a if you can catch it, it gives you something of your heart's desire. But I didn't know much about the Arthurian imagery of that, and so I went back and read, and there's a lot of in sort of early French Arthurian texts, there are lots of does, not just stags, with the white stag are more traditional, but the white doe is there as well, and it's a Christic image as well in Mallory. It talks about the whiteness as being like Christ's purity. Stags are
Mm.
traditionally a Christic image. So a lot of the just sort of numinous feel of that scene in Harry Potter, I think, as well as the Arthurian feel, comes from these sort of older texts. But I was absolutely delighted to find I was reading the Mabinogion, which has a white stag story, and it happens in the Forest of Dean. And I thought, oh, it's even in the Forest of Dean, just like it's in the Forest of Dean in Deathly Hallows. So it was one of those things where I think, yeah, I think she knew that. Yeah, the sort of circle, I was not expecting that circle to come round.
It's absolutely amazing to actually then gesture to just how well read she was when she was writing these texts, because I also heard that, she was very, she was doing poorly financially and she wrote them in restaurants on napkins, but she was just such an avid consumer of literature, even during that very difficult time in her life, that she managed to fit all these, I would say, quite academic, quite challenging texts
Yeah,
into her
yeah.
children's book series.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And she did study, so she studied classical texts at university along with, she was doing a modern languages degree. Um, Not classics itself, but classical text and translation. So a lot of, so I mean, Ovid, for example, is very present in Harry Potter. So she had a lot of that stuff from her university degrees, but she also always said, I wanted to study English literature, and her
Mm.
parents now hilariously said, you can't make any money from writing English, so you need to study
They're fighting their
something where you
words.
might make a job from it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it seems very ironic now.
Yeah,
Um, was someone who wanted to study English literature at university and who obviously carried on that love.
yeah, definitely.
Um, yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely.
Um, so I just want to close with two questions that are a bit cheeky, a bit funny. But so there were so many parts of this book, as we kind of walked through already, that draw such insightful, incredibly buried, but after pulling them out, incredibly clear connections with various authors, life events, texts, words. For example, I really like the one with Nocturne Alley, which you point out, which is a place of Death Eaters and cursed objects and scary, spooky energies. But you point out that there's a very strong connection with the word nocturnally, which actually, if you say it, sounds the exact same, nocturnally, nocturnally, which is a word insinuating darkness and, dark arts. So I want to ask you, what is your favorite allusion that you pulled out of this book? And also, I want to ask you, what is your favorite Shakespeare text?
Okay, so with the first one, I don't think I have an absolute favorite illusion, but I'll
Okay.
tell you one that I do sort of really like. It was a very general one, which is the sense of the connection between the world of magic and the world of literature. So I love the fact that the entrance to the magical world, the initial one, is the Leaky Cauldron entrance, and the Leaky Cauldron is beside a bookshop. So it's
Mm.
that sort of sense that it's beside a bookshop. And then she said, the reason it's on Charing Cross Road is because Charing Cross Road is a road famous for its bookshop. So the entry into the magical world is via books. And something I didn't know before I worked on this was that when Harry enters the Leaky Cauldron, the first witch that he meets, she's called Doris Crockford. And Doris Crockford is an author, and she wrote a book about the Flying Scotsman, the train that is the model for the Hogwarts Express. And I thought that was such a lovely just another little moment of saying books are the real magic, that she's present there.
Wow. And that she got her inspiration from literature, as is the entrance into magic for everyone is literature. Yeah, that is very
Um,
cool.
on the Shakespeare, um,
Yes.
I think King Lear is his greatest play, but my sort of, as it were, idiosyncratic answer is Henry IV Part One. So
Okay.
I think Henry IV Part One is spectacular play, and it's not as well known. Partly has this really boring title. I always say, this is like the most boring title. Part One is like, it sounds so dull. It's one of the things I absolutely love about it is the balance. So you have these very powerful, mainly two characters, which is Hal and Falstaff, and they are sort of antithetical in the way in which their stories are going. Falstaff wants to keep Hal back with him, wants to keep him louche and having fun, and this is all just a cover for his becoming king. And they're both so attractive and in their different ways. And critics have just continued to completely disagree about whether the play is sort of basically on Falstaff's side or basically on Hal's side. And
Mm.
I do think, 500 years later, people still can't quite decide where the balance lies. That's a sign of a sort of perfectly poised sense. It also has these other two main characters of Hotspur and the King, and this four-way sort of power structures or relationships. So each of those four characters has a relationship with the other. So instead of just being a sort of good versus evil two-way, you have this four-way relationship, which just adds such sort of complexity and narrative drive and dramatic interest to the way the play works. So yeah, that would be my idiosyncratic response.
No, definitely. I knew it was going to be like asking which one of your children is your favorite or
Exactly.
something.
Not allowed to ask this question, but given that we're not
Oh,
exactly.
definitely, definitely. Yeah, I actually have never read that play, so I will be sure to read it next. That is my next book to read.
Right.
That is amazing. I want to say thank you so much for talking to me today. I learned so much. I hope everyone listening did too. I think we went through a lot of intertextual kind of analyses, and I think, delved into what exactly is happening in some of these texts, and hopefully unpicked some of these things. So I think what you were saying about religion is really interesting, and I think what we were saying about illusion is prevalent in almost every piece of literature ever written. They're just constantly in conversation, constantly gesturing to one another. And I think that is a really important part of studying English and reading English, reading any language, I think. But yeah, so I want to say thank you so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I really enjoyed our conversation. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so did I. It's been lovely to speak to you.